Welcome to the beginning of Series 68, everyone. We are back and ready to cover more games with some amazing guests, and this series is no exception. We will be talking to Maso Perez, designer of the official TTRPG for the Boyfriend Dungeon video game called Life on the Edge. But before we get into it, here's what to expect in our calls to action.
It's been a month and we have some things to catch up on. We have new patrons to thank, a new review to read, and some reminders about our normal episode closer stuff. We are glad to be back after our much needed break. So join us back here after the show.
Until then, enjoy the show, everyone. Welcome to Character Creation Cast, a show where we discuss and create characters, the best part of role-playing games, with guests using their favorite systems. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan, and this episode, my co-host Amelia and I are excited to welcome Maso Perez from Kitfox Games to discuss their game, Life on the Edge, a TTRPG based on the Boyfriend Dungeon video game that lets you explore your inner psyche, confront your fears, and also smooch swords.
What more could you want? I feel like end of episode. That's great. We've sold it. That's okay.
So good.
Maso, welcome to Character Creation Cast. We're really excited that you could be here for this one. This is going to be so much fun.
I'm also really excited. This is the first time I'm appearing on something besides the Kitfox stream, actually.
Cool.
Ooh.
I feel so special now.
For the game.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about who you are, your pronouns, what sorts of things you do, where people can find your work? All of it. Everything.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm Maso Perez. I guess you'd call me an emerging writer because I'm still kind of getting my bearings on my career here, but emerging writer who has made a number of free RPGs before this one. And I'm non-binary and queer. I use any, all pronouns, but he, him is fine. Like, I'm not at all bothered by just, the standard of what people would assume about me. And in regards to this whole thing is just that, like, I played Boyfriend Dungeon out when it came out, had a blast with it, made a fan game just for fun that I called Dual Wield, which you can still download. It's free, but it's a little bit different than this game and not quite as polished, obviously. And then about, I think it was around July, I randomly just cold messaged Kitfox if they were curious about licensing it. And it turned out that I just had really lucky timing because they were explicitly looking for someone to make a tabletop game of some kind, preferably for Boyfriend Dungeon.
Nice. That is so cool.
Yeah, I got really lucky that way. But I've also worked a little bit in developing children's television. I was a development writer for a little bit.
Nice.
And right now I'm just basically a freelancer, but collaborating with Kitfox Games on this. And it's been really exciting and really fun. First time I've put out an RPG that has its own art that I didn't just scribble.
That's always exciting. Like when you get to like commission artists and work with artists and stuff and just like when you like send them your thoughts and then they send something back and you're like, I didn't even know I wanted that. Like it's always, it's such a cool feeling when you get to do that.
Absolutely.
Best part of the process.
Hands down.
What's in a game?
All right. So what is the core concept of Life on the Edge?
So Life on the Edge diverges just a little bit from the video game, where rather than the core concept being about playing as a wielder who's romancing multiple weapons, and as your romance gets stronger with them, they get stronger. That's the video game. For the tabletop game, instead, what I built it around was instead that it was going to be about everybody in the party being a weapon and taking turns wielding each other. So this was kind of based on something that was in the video game where one of the characters, the first character you meet, Isaac, mentions that he has also been a wielder before, despite being a weapon. And that just got me thinking, well, then you can have an entire party of dungeon delvers who are all just weapons taking turns wielding each other. And so from that core concept, it became this kind of thing where the gameplay loop is supposed to be based around dramatizing how friends support each other, essentially. Because the weapons play a little bit more of a supporting role in the combat, but they still get an active role in it. And instead of it being that just some people are the weapons and some people are the wielders, we all take turns and give each other a chance to shine as wielder and as weapon, thereby creating a more kind of symbiotic relationship between the two characters instead of focusing on the wielders. And ultimately, because it's about that and because it was already baked into the video game, it also took on that persona-like thing where it's about going into psychic dungeons and like sword fighting your traumas directly, allowing you to help move past them and grow as a person because you have this support circle of people. So a lot of the game is very focused on like the mental well-being of the protagonists, and most of the emergent storyline comes from that rather than a GM like coming up with a plot.
Interesting.
That's very cool.
Yeah. That was the goal for it. So it's definitely played in a loop of out of dungeon stuff, in dungeon, boss fight, out of dungeon stuff, and you keep going in the loop as much as possible. It's also one of the few RPGs where your character doesn't die unless you want them to.
Ooh, nice.
Oh, very cool. I like having that agency for a player.
Yeah, there is still a thing that can happen where you lose access to your character, where they actually become a boss in the dungeon temporarily.
Oh.
But once they're defeated, you get them back.
Oh, that's good. So for someone who has not played the video game either, what can you tell us about like the setting and the world and kind of like what the background of that is?
For sure. So we tried our best to create the tabletop game as kind of setting agnostic. Every single weapon that you can be is going to be a melee weapon. So that means that they can technically be present at any point in human history or even in fantasy settings.
Okay.
The video game itself is set in Verona Beach, California, and it's just kind of focused on one summer. And the way it works is it's basically our world, but there's a lot less of like a kind of, you don't really get too strong of a sense of a governmental structure. Capitalism is still present. Economic systems are still present. But like, I don't think you ever see a police officer, and like a lot of the stuff that's handled tends to be handled by the characters rather than ever kind of any kind of appeal to an authority. But fundamentally, the way it works is that every so often people's fears and anxieties build up in a location. And when they get strong enough, that location turns into a dungeon where it kind of sinks into the floor and enters this strange void where monsters and even objects will become like sentient and running around and attacking anybody who enters it. And as a result, there's a gig economy of people who go into those dungeons, fight the monsters drop loose change, and that's your spending money in the game, right? And the deeper you go, the more money they have. But every enemy and every boss is supposed to represent a fear or anxiety present in the space.
Okay.
And for the tabletop game, we expand that a little bit in that the further into the campaign you get, the more the dungeons should be less about a space and more about you. So your first dungeon might just be like a shopping mall where it's a fear of change or a fear of socialization. But later on, if you as a player say like, I want my abusive father or something to be a boss in a dungeon, then your family home you grew up in might become a dungeon in its own right with your father as the final boss.
Okay.
Obviously, since we play with a lot of that kind of psychic mentality and the characters' struggles, as we call them, are one of the main focuses, there needs to be a lot of back and forth between the MC and the players about what's appropriate. Although I use that example of the abusive father, in the book, it's actually used as an example of something that a player might say, I do not want that to be a boss. I do not want to fight my character's father, right? So you can vary it up and change how you want to approach it, but it's always good to have that open communication. And as a result, like, that's how it works. But in terms of the setting, I'm going off a little bit on tangent.
No,
sorry.
you're fine.
But
That's what you're here for.
in terms of the setting, we do have a little page that's just about like customizing settings. And because none of the mechanics rely on a specific setting besides the mechanic of transforming into weapons and the dungeons themselves, and the dungeons are kind of a foreign concept to whatever setting you're putting it in anyway.
Right.
That means that you can just put it in like Faerun if you wanted, right?
Yeah.
Like you can theoretically add it to other settings and just change or tweak stuff a little bit.
Yeah.
And for creating your own setting, for anybody who's really new to RPGs, I mention also that you can just take keywords where you take time period and genre and stick them together, and you already have a setting.
Ooh.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like all you need to do is if you say what's it called? Pirates and romantic, that's a setting.
Yeah.
That already evokes a bunch of stuff in your head. And if you say like futuristic and dystopian or something like that, those are obviously also going to be their own setting. So that's how we kind of outline the setting, but all of the example dungeons and stuff are still set in Verona Beach using familiar faces, partly because we assume that most people playing the tabletop game will have played the video game. And that way you can wrap your head around how the mechanics work in relation to stuff you already know.
Gotcha.
So what sort of tools do we need to play this game then?
This game was very much designed with as little physical tools as possible so that people could play it easier online, as well as when you do get in person, you don't need a lot. So you just need 2 6-sided dice and your character sheet, obviously. The main rule book, which is only 50 pages. It's not particularly long for RPG standards anyway. And everything else is done in theater of the mind. One of the things actually written in the dungeon guides and things like that is to say that if you can map a dungeon, it doesn't belong in this game.
Interesting.
I personally like that very much. But
bob and weave, they change shape as you explore them is supposed to be the idea. So instead,
very cool.
The moves themselves shape whether or not you make progress, rather than it being based around, did you pick the right
Should we go
path?
left or right?
Yeah.
That's very cool.
I like that.
I like that there's an in-universe explanation for that too, because like there's too many games that are like, okay, well, you do you, right? Yeah. And then there's going to be a lot of, dungeon masters or game masters that are like, well, I'm just going to make a dungeon and they got to follow the right path.
And the quality can vary a lot. A lot of people have a lot of conflicting philosophies. But like the video game itself was partially procedurally generated. Like the dungeons themselves were procedurally generated. So it had a bit of a roguelike element to it.
Yeah.
And this game, this tabletop game, has a lot of shared DNA with the tabletop game Rhapsody of Blood, which is meant for Castlevania-like games.
Okay.
And it already had a kind of built-in procedurally generating dungeon, but for tabletop. So I kind of I brought on that mechanic into this to help keep this game also shaped that way. Yeah. And in the end, it's really funny because then it ends up being more accurate to the video game too.
Yeah, that's very cool.
So we've touched on it a little bit here with, talking about like dungeons being, fears and anxieties and traumas and stuff. But are there specific stories and themes that you felt, especially making it based off of a video game already, that you were like, this has to be part of it? This is what makes it this game.
Yeah, so there definitely is. I had mentioned it earlier in that the game is very much interested in the support system that the party builds, the kind of found family that we always build when we make a tabletop campaign happen, right? Even if everybody's at each other's throats at the beginning, by the end, there's in-jokes, there's memes even with our characters often, and we get this kind of sense of like a shared history with each other. And Life on the Edge is very concerned with that because there's 2 methods of harm in it, which is actually pretty important to this point. One of them is you can take harm to your body, which only happens when you're in your wielder form. The weapons can't take harm, which is how we always justify escaping the dungeon when someone gets hurt, because there's always people who are not hurt at all. But if your harm gets filled up, you just have to leave the dungeon. That's all that has to happen. It doesn't mean that you die unless you want your character to die, or you're playing a game where that setting suggests that, right? Like if you want to be a darker setting. The other type of harm, though, that you get is called fear, which obviously relates back to what we're talking about. And fears can be caused by a number of different effects, usually enemies or hazards or bosses. But when your fear track fills up, you have a stat called break, and it goes up a notch. For each level of break you go up, something will happen like a weapon move will break or a wielder move will break. That makes you generally less effective. But when you get to 3 advances in break, your character becomes the broken self. So it's very important to decrease break between each dungeon run, because the broken self is where you actually lose access to your character mechanically. Like, you don't have the choice to say, oh, I'm going to keep my character, though. No, your break is full. You are broken. They need to go and fight you and help fix you, basically. And so as a result, the way it works is that anytime you're outside the dungeon, one of the moves, and the only move with like very solid mechanics outside of the dungeon, is called bond, where you are required to sit down in character with somebody else and strengthen your bond with them. And you can't leave that scene until everyone feels satisfied with how it went, basically. And by doing that, you heal your break and increase your link, which is a resource that you can use to boost your rolls, but also represents your relationships with other characters.
Gotcha. So you're like, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to have my little therapy session with my friend, you know, like your little girls' night, girl talk, whatever.
Yeah. You literally can't be a murder hobo in this game mechanically. You need to sit down and talk in character and work stuff out sometimes. And if you don't,
express
you will lose your character.
Yes.
And so
that's funny.
Also as a result, that also means that there's a heavy focus on struggles as the main driving force, where when you create your character, you need to make at least one struggle to start. And you can pick up more as you go, but you have that one struggle. And the goal of the game overall is the campaign ends when everyone's struggles have been like resolved. We don't like to say straight up solved. We don't want to assume that anybody is making or fixing a struggle completely. But the idea is supposed to be that your character gets to a point where they can more healthily engage with and accept that part of themselves and move on, so to speak.
Yeah, where
or at least be in a space where they can help others.
Terrible pits are no longer opening in the earth underneath them is really...
Exactly.
Really your treatment goal at this point.
Yeah. So ideally, the story is always going to be about a group of people who are struggling with something, who find a way to solve it together and come out the other side better adjusted as a result. This isn't supposed to be a game that results in a tragedy by the end.
Okay.
Right.
Because the only way that you fully lose access to your characters... Theoretically, I guess, actually, come to think of it, I guess technically you could lose a campaign if the entire party is broken.
And just like refuses to talk about it. Like, yeah.
But
if you all opt into toxic masculinity, then you can you can lose the game.
on our last playtest, actually, that was one of our characters' struggles, because he was just a toxic frat boy of a guy, basically.
Oh no!
Otherwise, he was wholesome. Like, he was a really nice dude, but he had a lot of the common issues that come with that kind of environment, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm curious. But, I'm sure we'll get into this when we do some of our character creation and stuff. But like, how? What does the game do to support you, like, coming up with those kinds of backgrounds for your character? Because, you know, that is, like, I think a lot of us, there are a lot of people out there that are like, I have my full 10-page backstory that I've written for my character and stuff. But there are definitely people that come into games and are like, I don't know, we'll play to find out. But also, like, already knowing is part of playing. So...
We tried to really encompass a kind of brevity as the soul of wit thing in creating the characters. I was heavily influenced by a very not well-known RPG called Artesia Adventures in the Known World. It's kind of an offshoot of Burning Wheel, which a lot of people have heard of. But it has a system called the Life Path, that helps you roll up a character as you go. And instead of handling it as like, these are your stats, roll them, it handles it as like, let's unlock your childhood and all these other elements as you go through your entire character's life before you start the game.
Yeah.
It's not as in-depth as that. But what I really liked about that system was that Mark Smiley, the writer of the system, was really good at making a very short sentence that completely filled your mind with possibilities immediately. Like, it's just vague enough. And that was the goal of ours, which we called the character narrative prompts.
Okay.
We call them prompts because you're not required to take them if you roll. You can roll and go, oh, I got this. I know I don't want that.
Yeah.
Before I rolled, I didn't know at all what I wanted. But now that I've rolled, I know I at least don't want that. Right?
Yeah.
Yep.
And you can keep narrowing it down, or you can just do it once and be like, I know I don't want that, so I want this instead.
Yeah.
And that's the goal of the system. But to answer your question more directly, one of the prompts, only one, there is a question that is like just essentially, what is your character struggling with? And you'll get to see it, but it's about 11 different options. And I tried my best to encompass a kind of vague sentence that gives you a world of possibilities of filling in the details for each of them.
Okay.
They're all distinct, but at the same time, they are not like a story. They're just a start of one.
Yeah. Yeah, just that seed of an idea. It's better than just writing down like, hey man, what's your deal?
Yeah. Like,
what's your problem?
It's the difference. It's the difference between, in a fantasy, like a high fantasy game, it's the difference between writing in for a character creation prompt. You could write in, you were kidnapped by elves and now resent humans, right?
Right.
Or you could write a sentence that says, you were taken from your birth family and may have conflicting or outright like hostile opinions of one of the two groups involved in this situation, right? Like that kind of, that's a little wordy. Obviously, I would trim that down if I was putting it in a book.
Right.
But the idea being there is now I can replace elves with fairies or orcs or giants.
And it gives you the opportunity as a
Mm-hmm.
player to be like, okay, here's how I feel about that, rather than being like, you hate elves now.
Yeah.
Like, oh,
Exactly.
I do?
Right?
Well, that's a bummer. Okay.
Yeah. So like that's the goal of it, and that's how the system helps with that. And a good amount of the struggles are based on the ones from the characters in the game. But there were only like, I think there's 8 characters in the game, so there's still a good chunk of them are kind of brand new struggles to deal with.
Awesome.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about what characters actually do in the game with the exploring dungeons and relationships with themselves. But I see that there's 5 different character types that you can be effectively, and that's based upon what type of weapon you are. So like what we've been talking about the person and the weapon and transferring from one to another. How does that sort of experience work in the game? How do characters do that and handle that with one another?
Right. So typically, although you can transform into your weapon form outside of a dungeon, the duality of the two forms is covered also in the duality of being in the dungeon and being out of it, where generally speaking, you almost never need to be a weapon outside of the dungeon. And when you're inside of the dungeon, your wielder form is going to be focused on if the dungeon narratively kind of resonates with you.
Okay.
But in terms of specifically how the game runs, when you enter the dungeon, it's split up into a further kind of 2 sections. There's traversal, which is getting through the dungeon, and there's dueling, which is fighting the big bosses that hold the dungeon together. Once you defeat a boss, that part of the dungeon kind of dissipates. So depending on the dungeon, some of them, they might not dissipate until the final boss is cleared. Some of them, if it's like a mall, it might be sections of the mall. And then when you defeat the boss of that section, the section is available to the public again. But generally the way it works is in traversal, the game is a lot more fluid about it. If you want to picture yourself as turning into your weapon and flying around like a dancing sword with no wielder, you can do that. Another thing that I suggested is, for most people, I think it's easier to picture actions based around the human body anyway. So I say that the way it works is you can manifest your own weapon form and wield yourself during traversal. But then in the boss room, because the boss is so powerful, you need to fully crystallize that form to do any damage to it, which is also kind of followed by that bosses have a different health system than players and are a lot sturdier than any regular enemy. So when that happens, half of the party becomes weapons and the other half remains as wielders. And then in dueling specifically, the moves are different depending on which one you are.
Okay.
So there are a bunch of specialized character type moves that play off of, like, usually you can't use this when you're a weapon, but now you can because you took this move, right? Stuff like that.
That's very cool.
So then is it like you can make like interesting combinations based on who's wielding what weapon and stuff? Okay.
Ideally. We, in Dual Wield, the original system that it was built on, there was also a system for wielder-based moves. But we wanted to keep it simple so that people who had played the video game and maybe never touched a tabletop game before could just pick it up and play.
Yeah.
So the mechanics are heavily weighted towards the weapons. There's still a good amount of stuff that applies when you're a wielder, but mostly towards the weapons. But the way it works is that in like Dungeons and Dragons, we know that we have like player goes, enemy goes, and then you go back and forth. But for those who have not played Powered by the Apocalypse games, the enemy only acts if you fail or if you get a partial success.
Right.
And so because of that, I was able to build a 2-step combat system, but instead of it being on player, enemy, it's instead based on player, like weapon and wielder, wielder and weapon, right? So if I'm wielding Ryan's character and I take an action as the wielder to reposition us so we're close enough to strike, then it's Ryan's turn next because we are a unit, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
And so he can immediately act upon what I just did. And
very cool.
Yeah. The other thing is that no boss can be damaged by a single move. You have to open them to harm, and then another move damages them.
Okay.
Oh.
And as a result, there needs to be that element of teamwork where the wielder opens them to harm and the weapon damages, or the weapon opens them and the wielder damages.
Yeah.
So you need to have that back and forth kind of thing. And obviously, if you have more than 2 players, then I could move up, Ryan could open him, and then your character, Amelia, could immediately rush over and damage that opening. It's not locked to a specific character.
Okay.
So it's always trying to reinforce that rhythm of teamwork rather than just it being kind of like face tanking blows at each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you feel like, like you've talked about a couple different games that you've pulled from and, obviously like the video game that kind of started this, like what do you feel makes this game particularly unique, both from like the source material and from other games that we might have played?
I think that the core gimmick, you could say, quotation marks, in and of itself makes it feel quite unique. I don't like using terms like gimmicks when we talk about game design if I can help it, because I feel that they're very limiting in terms of like what people are talking about. Like any mechanic is theoretically a gimmick. Any flavor is theoretically a gimmick.
Yeah.
Like, would Skyrim have gone as big if it wasn't Nordic? Maybe, but also a lot of people at the time really wanted to play a Viking fantasy game. So that's part of what helped it, right?
Yeah.
So like the core gimmick, you could say, of you are able to transform into a weapon, like a number of anime and other kind of pieces of media, that's an interesting thing, because usually when we're doing it in interactive media, like the original game, we're not playing as the weapon, we're playing as a person wielding the weapon, and the weapon is like a friend or something. We always kind of conceptualize them in that pairing. But I wanted to create a game where I thought it would be interesting, where instead of there being a support class, everybody takes turns being the support depending on the battle. So that's a primary thing that I think makes it feel pretty unique.
Yeah.
And then another thing is that I do think that the loop of like specifically codifying that there is a mechanical incentive to have in-character moments makes it interesting in and of itself, because it also means that sometimes you as a player and by extension as your character need to force one. And that can make for immediate drama of like, I need to get this out, right? I don't care if you're not ready. I need to talk about this. That's a scene that can happen in this game. And in other games, I feel like sometimes people have a kind of fear or an aversion to that kind of role play. That they worry that it'll get like too personal or that like somebody will get upset or something. But another thing is that because rarely games ever incentivize doing that, a lot of groups don't want to deal with it. Whereas it can be very cathartic and dramatic and fun. And by incentivizing it, I think that this game kind of sets itself apart by saying like, do that. Like, have those scenes, have characters yell at each other or have them bond in a cozy way. But like, keep that up. Every so often, we have to keep bringing that break stat down. So we have to keep bonding. And if we just are all angry at each other, that leads to an interesting scene where all of our characters are forced to bond.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it gives you something to do, you know, because like there are games where it's like, okay, you need downtime or whatever. And it's like, but you can easily hand wave it and be like, oh, long rest. We slept the full night. Like, we're great, you know, whatever. And then there are other games where people are like, well, we want to have downtime. We want to do these things. But the game is like, gives you nothing to do with that. And so it's all on the GM to sort of like facilitate that or players to come up with it themselves. And there's no like mechanical anything and there's no like narrative impact based on that. So like, I think it's interesting to have something where it's like you A, need to do this and B, you need to like play it out actually. And not just say like, well, absolutely, we talked, we're good. Ta-da.
Yeah. As you're actually talking about it, it reminded me that part of the reason that it kind of baked in as I was building is that I run a lot of games, obviously. And one of my best friends of like my whole life, who is regularly in games with me, has always been very transparent for like the last 5 years or so, that his favorite thing to do in an RPG is throw a party.
Yes.
Like he just wants his character to throw a party and all the NPCs that we've befriended to show up and have all these stupid little interactions where everybody's so hanging out.
Yeah. That makes my heart so happy. Like, what a good...
Yeah, like... He just adores that. And I was like, yeah, I like those scenes too. And my groups have diverged so far from what you can typically expect from like a random group of people you pull together to play 5th edition. Right. Like where everybody's relying so heavily on like, well, I don't want to do that because it's not quite in the system kind of thing. Right. Or that's an optional rule. I don't know if I'm comfy with that. And in my games, a lot of it tends to be very like, who cares? Like, we'll just throw that out. We'll homebrew that. We'll do this. We'll do that. There's a sense of intimacy. And I wanted that to kind of be baked into the system that like the mechanics incentivize and reinforce character intimacy.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be romantic or, you know, but.
And it's a thing that I've noticed with like a lot of people who play D&D, a lot of like actual play podcasts and stuff. And people are like, look at these great stories we're telling and like all of these. And it's like, yeah, but the game didn't do that. You did that. Like the mechanics didn't have you do this. You did that despite the mechanics, you know? And so it's like, I love when games are like, no, you actually like, we put this in there to support those kinds of things. Rather than just being like, well, it happened while we were also playing D&D, you know? Yeah.
You could argue that there's a big grand split because we are still technically in the golden age of RPGs, I guess you could say, right? Like, or at least the Renaissance, whatever you prefer to phrase it as. But like, you have OSR, old school role playing, going in the direction of like, straightforward mechanics, emergent narrative, where the narrative is born from what you do in the game. Right. And then on the other side is where this game sits, and a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games, Forged in the Dark, that kind of thing, where I would argue that they have emergent mechanics, where the narrative changes the context of the mechanics, and the mechanics are often subject to that context. Yeah. And so those ones you usually come in and it's like, I know who this character is. I have a rough idea of what their story is going to be like, and we're going to find out how. Whereas in OSR, it's like, I have a list of my stats and abilities or equipment or whatever. That's all I have mechanically. Everything else is technically up to me and the game master to work out as we play.
Yeah, it's much more like, I know what I can do, and then we'll figure out why. You know, whereas, like something like PBTA is. Like, I know why I can do it. I don't know how, though.
Yeah. So, like, it's all about the different levels of that. But this game definitely, I think, I wanted to take that, and if we're having these emerging mechanics from the narrative, I wanted that narrative to be about the group rather than to be about a story the group is jumping into. Yeah. We are the plot.
Yes. Yeah.
That's very cool. And I know you talked a little bit, or you started talking about this, how it's a focus in this game about all relationships, not just romantic, right? Like platonic as well is very important, that you can explore that in this game. Did you want to expand on that a little bit? Yeah, because
I think that it's still kind of a less is more, similar to how I was talking about the descriptive character prompts. But generally what it is that the game gives no special treatment to romantic relationships, and it never writes any relationship assuming it's romantic. That's, I think, the core of what helps it out, because I think we have a tendency to want to gamify romance. There was a question when we were creating this, like, do we want there to be any moves about, like, dating? Do we want there to be, like, the loop that when you're outside of the dungeon, you're dating, and when you're inside of the dungeon, you're fighting? And we ultimately decided not to, which is true to the game again, because the game, you can choose any relationship to be platonic in the game. You can just click an option and the rest of the plot will turn it platonic. And then there's also there's one of the characters you can romance is a cat. His name's Pocket. And all you do with him is you just bond with him, and you don't own him. He's not your pet. He's just a cat you met that likes you and spends time with you sometimes. And I don't want to spoil the end of his story in case anybody plays the game. But, like, it's never a romantic bond between you and Pocket. It's not that kind of a thing, right?
Right.
So, to me, I really liked that, because fundamentally why they did that in Boyfriend Dungeon, I think, was for the queer inclusion, so that asexual people and aromantic people could have just as much of a blast as everybody else and enjoy those kinds of dynamics and still bond with characters. Because in a lot of games, it's like, if you don't romance them, you don't get to see their full story sometimes, right? So I wanted to capture that, but ultimately we decided to do the less is more approach, where relationships are very important in Life on the Edge, but none of them are ever assumed to be romantic. So if you want to play romantic, it's gonna feel like a romantic relationship still, because you're doing that. But if you don't want to do romantic and you don't want to gamify romance, you don't want it to ever be like, well, I succeeded on my role, so you have to date me now, right?
Right, yeah. That feels a little skeevy sometimes. That you're like, but I don't want to. Like,
and we didn't want that mentality going into the game as well, as much as possible. So, like, for the playtests that we live streamed, the first playtest, all three characters were sisters. You know?
Yeah.
And then in the second one, they were all mutual friends who were becoming better friends together because they were going into the dungeon to save their mutual friend who got lost in there. So, like, there's a lot of different ways to approach it. But
oh my God, now I want to play one that's like a bachelorette party. That it's just like, like you're all, it's like you've got like one person that knows everybody, and then like the other people don't really know each other. You know what I mean? Oh, okay.
You open up so many possibilities by just not giving special treatment to something.
Yeah.
You know? It lets you really just run wild with, like, silly, fun concepts to start the game off at least. And you get to decide how much of it is like a cold open where you're just right in the action.
Yeah.
That's amazing. This is the part where we talk about the history of the game. Usually I'll go to Wikipedia and pull some various facts and whatnot.
You say that, but like we cover so many like new and indie games that you really don't go to Wikipedia that often.
I can't do that anymore. I can't do that anymore.
You did that for like 3 or 4 games. Like, you can do that for your...
quite a few more than that, honestly. But no, this is a brand new game. It just came out. By the time this episode releases, it's just a couple weeks ago, right? It's because it's out now, right?
Yeah.
And it was released on itch.io, Drive-Thru, and curiously, Steam.
Yes. That really confused me. I was like, everybody's like, you can get it on Steam. And I was like, I thought it was a tabletop game. And they're like, yeah, but you can get it on Steam. And I was like, I don't understand the words you're saying.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the history there?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I already talked about how the game kind of came together. But in terms of the release, we kind of just worked in parallel with each other, where they were like, you can handle DriveThruRPG and itch.io as you like. We're going to do it via a Steam release, and then we would split it based on those kinds of things. And the way it worked was that, as far as I can understand it, on Steam, they already have a system for just downloading generic files of some kind.
Right.
And it's mostly for like art books, soundtracks, things like that are usually a supplemental DLC that you can grab on top of the game.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Kitfox decided that I guess the like most, speedy or their preferred way of doing it, maybe because they already just have a presence on the marketplace, was to release Life on the Edge as a DLC for Boyfriend Dungeon.
Yeah.
So if you want to buy it through Steam, you already have to own the game. So the idea is that the players who already own the game can get this immediate notice, even if they don't follow Kitfox Games on their various social media. They'll get the notice on Steam that, hey, a DLC just dropped, and then they can check it and be like, oh, a tabletop RPG.
They've
and
got that
there, you just go
built-in
into
audience, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you just go into your Steam apps file, and you can grab the file. But it also led to a little bit of confusion because, like you said, it's never been done before, as far as we're aware. There were actually a few places that were curious to interview Kitfox about that, because they're like, I don't think I've ever seen a tabletop game be released on Steam. And there was actually a really funny thing where on release day, a few people were like, how do I get the game? Because I bought it, but I don't have it. And they're like, oh, you have to go into your Microsoft file folder and Explorer and go to here. And that's the divide where if you grab it on Steam, you can just grab it really quick, and Kitfox puts it on sale there a little bit more often, so you'll get 10% off. But also, you just have to kind of dig through your files and grab it as well. Yeah. And that might be confusing to some people. Whereas on itch.io and DriveThruRPG, it's just a straight, grab it, downloads directly to your downloads folder, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But
you can't use all those Steam gift cards you got for Christmas to buy it that way. So.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Kitfox in general seems to be closer to almost like a artist collective from my only slightly in the loop view, because I've only worked with them on this project. I'm not a formal employee, where I'm more like a partner, I guess you could say. But from what I can tell, it looks like most of them are all working for the company, but work on project by project rather than working on every single thing all together at once.
Gotcha.
And as a result, they're really good and really fair, and really wanted to make sure that I was getting the lion's share of the income from the game sales.
Oh, that's really cool.
Nice.
So I don't want to go too in depth about how it works, but part of the reason they wanted to do it on Steam as well was because that way it's easier for them to track, and we don't have to keep sending invoices back and forth to each other about what's going on. So they're really good about that stuff. There have been some really funny business meetings where they'll be nervous to ask me something, and I'll be like, yeah, that's fine. This game wouldn't have happened without you guys. And then they're like, oh, okay, good. But they're really nice people.
It's a really good experience. So you've heard so many stories that are the opposite of that it's
yeah. In general, it definitely feeds into that too. But that's definitely part of why the platforms are set up that way. And I'm also curious to see how it will do. And if Kitfox wants to make a game in the future, I don't know if they're going to want to release it on Steam again. And if they do, I wonder if Valve will ever have to think about that and think about how they might institute a feature related to that. Because then Steam could theoretically jump into this area too if it really wanted to. It already is really well established.
It effectively could just be a new itch.io format, right? Where it's you've got the presence, I've got hundreds of games probably on Steam that I never play.
I have 3.
But If I could go out and grab a TTRPG PDF from Steam and just like auto download it and go to the folder right from Steam, that'd be amazing.
Well, especially like, I think it's really interesting for those like, you know, those ones that already have IPs that are based in video games, you know, like getting something like the Fallout role-playing game when you play the Fallout game, you know, like because you're, it's going to be a lot of the same audience, right? Like it's going to be, you know, I mean, not necessarily like all role-playing gamers are like on Steam all the time, but like if you're buying those particular games, right, you probably have the video game already. So, and especially like to be able to launch that way, be like, oh, it's available as DLC for this game that you already have. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see too, cool. Like because it's on all of those different platforms, like where it gains the traction. Then it'll be a fun little like statistical experiment.
Plus, like auto updates on RPGs sounds amazing. Like if I could get the latest rule set,
like version 1.1,
if there's like errata that's getting fixed, like I don't have to go to the itch page and re-download it and find a place for my old PDF or just delete it, which feels weird.
Can you easily see things in your Steam library? Because you certainly can't in your itch library.
So yeah, no, it's exciting to be kind of on the cutting edge there. No pun intended.
Pun fully intended.
Living life on the edge, one could say. Yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. I'll be interested to follow up in a few months and find out like what your experience has been like being the first RPG on Steam.
I don't
know if it's going to make news for most people, but we'll see.
We'll be following the story. Yeah. So before we get into our actual character creation part, our last little bit is just talking through any kind of terms and concepts that we might need to know in order to be able to follow along. Looks like Ryan has listed a few here. We got edges, flaws, moves, struggles, and links. So I don't know if you want to talk about some of those. I'll let you take the lead on that.
I could also mention the stats, because although they follow a very kind of straightforward thing, we use different names for them to reinforce the kind of like that they work both for weapons and for people. Essentially, it just goes, there's heft, which is basically strength, right? Physicality, physical presence, that kind of thing. Explosive power, that's all heft. We have keen, which is what would be usually your dexterity. I will try not to go on a tangent, but to put it very simply, it is not the acrobatics stat. Heft is the acrobatics stat. You know, keen and dexterity, in my opinion, should always be like the lock-picking stat, like the fine motion. But keen refers to that, like finer motions, skill, precision, that kind of thing. Not speed, right? Speed is covered by heft. It's a form of strength when you really think about it.
Okay.
And then you have sting. Sting refers to your mental acuity. So like perception, intelligence, those kinds of things. In weapon form, the reason it has the name sting is it also refers to like how much damage you do when you actually strike home.
The
right?
sword from Lord of the Rings.
Like heft and keen are more like how you get there. Right? Like heft, you smash something out of your way and then strike, and keen, you weave through it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas with sting, it's about that like actual puncture or slash that you hit, how much pain you inflict.
Got it.
Okay.
But normally it refers to mental acuity, like how sharp your brain is, right?
Smart.
And then the last one is core. And core is supposed to be like your hardiness, but I also paired it up with charisma. So this is a little bit of a unique combination in that it's essentially like your constitution and your charisma are the same stat in this game.
Okay.
And the reason I thought of it that way is because this game is so heavily focused on relationships, that's your rock character. That's the character who's always sturdy and stable and everybody feels safe around them.
Yeah.
They are the one that will defend you when they take a block or whatever. And they're also the one that will comfort you when you're feeling hurt or scared. So that was the premise behind core. But those are the 4 stats. Edges are your tags, right? So they're like, you know, in D&D, for instance, we have the finesse tag that we throw on a bunch of weapons that lets you use dexterity for some stuff. So it's like that, where they're passive abilities that you have as a result of the form and function of your weapon.
Okay.
A forceful weapon is a weapon that knocks people back with certain types of swings, right?
Yeah.
That is just because it is that kind of a weapon.
Gotcha.
You don't need to have like a specific rated ability to pull that off.
Okay.
Flaws are the opposite. They are weakness tags that you have in addition. The most obvious one being two-handed.
Yes.
If you're a two-handed weapon, you can't be dual-wielded. And as a result, that's the downside. But other ones are a little bit more interesting, like fragile, where you take double fear when you're fighting bosses. So you break a lot faster than most weapons do, right? It's actually a surprisingly popular one.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a very risk and reward focused one.
Yes.
So ambit is a little bit of an archaic word, but it basically means like range or reach.
Okay.
But the reason that I chose it wasn't because I just wanted a different word, but because ambit doesn't just refer to what you can like touch. It refers to what you control.
Oh.
So when you say something is within your ambit, it's like saying the guy is within his element.
Oh, like
right?
ambition.
It's something he can do really well, right?
Okay.
And so the ambit is technically it's how long your weapon is, but it more specifically refers to at what distance is your weapon best at being itself, right? So like a spear is really good at the reach ambit, but if you step past the reach ambit, unlike in D&D, it's not going to work very well anymore because you're past the head.
Yeah. Right.
They have to pull it back and try to stab you, but it's harder to stab at close range than it is at the proper range, right? So there's 3 of them. There's just short, long, and reach. But I just wanted to clarify that that's what ambit means.
Gotcha.
It's not. It's a little bit of a weird word, so some people get a bit hung up on it.
Yeah.
So moves in Powered by the Apocalypse games, moves refer to any like role or action you take that has built-in mechanics. So outside of the dungeon, the overcome move is the closest to like what a standard D&D move is like. It's just pick a stat depending on what you're doing, roll that, add the stat, you're good. It has degrees of success. But there are other moves that don't require rolling, and there are also moves on your character sheet that are unique to you, which would be similar to something like feats or abilities, right? But they're all referred to as moves because all of them kind of encompass like either an action you take or how an action changes as a result of your ability, rather than like being an entire system in and of themselves, the way that like spellcasting tends to be in a lot of games. So it can get a little bit confusing for some people, but usually we'll preface moves with either downtime moves, which is outside of the dungeon, traversal moves, which is moving through the dungeon, dueling moves, which is for fighting bosses, and then weapon moves refers to your specific like class-based abilities.
Okay.
Struggles, we've kind of touched on. Struggles are like your character's specific trauma or backstory as they understand it. They do not necessarily have a mechanical component, besides that when they end, when they're considered to be resolved, things in the mechanics change a little bit. But generally speaking, they are just like a descriptive phrase, but they are a cornerstone of the system. They're a narrative mechanical element. And then links are a little bit similar, but they have one mechanical aspect. Link is a specific relationship that you have with somebody. They can increase from 1 to 3, and when they reach 3, you can reset them if you want to, if they would increase again, and just keep going. But basically their level is also kind of equivalent to something like inspiration or a meta currency, where you can pull on it to get a bonus. So if me and Amelia's characters both have link level 1 with each other, then if I'm wielding Amelia's character or she's wielding me, we can use that on any roll that involves both of us. But also, if I'm separate from Amelia, like she's been captured by a boss, and I'm making a roll to get her back, I can use it for that because I'm making an action that pertains to her. Or even if she's not physically present, but I am fighting her angry, ex or something like that, her evil ex, then like that would also allow me to use that link because I'm leveraging that relationship. When you use it that way, the relationship goes down a notch, but it's less to do with like thinking of it like if you have 0 or 1 in a link, that means it's going badly, and more to do with just like feeling more like you miss them.
Mhm.
Like you would want to go and have a bonding move with them specifically to get that link up. But in character, it doesn't need to be as dramatic as like you're about to have a blow up fight or anything. There's no consequence for reducing a link to 0.
Gotcha.
It's just there to help, right? But in order to increase it, you do need to make the bond move with that character specifically.
Okay.
I like that.
Those are the terms.
Very cool. It sounds like we have enough to get started on making some characters. So do we want to hop into it? Do we want to make some people?
Yes.
Let's make some people.
So what do we need to do to get started? I've got character sheets and I've got a book opened up to a page that says like making characters.
Yeah, I would recommend we can just jump right to page 8 because the process is pretty straightforward, and a lot of the like discussion and the actual description in the book about what character creation is mostly there either for newer players or for people who are curious about the philosophy. But I think you guys will probably pick up the philosophy as we do it, and you'll see what it feels like. But number 8 already has us on the narrative prompt questions. There's a play example below that shows also like what all of the characters, like a handful of the characters from the game, are like making themselves in the tabletop game.
Oh, interesting.
So that was part of the way that I hoped to make it easier to understand for people who played the video game but haven't played a tabletop. So it's like, oh, I know this character. This is how their abilities work. But we can mostly ignore those. You don't need to look at the black boxes for play examples during character creation because we're just focusing on you guys.
Because we have you here to talk us through it.
Exactly. I'm right here. So the first thing that we do is we want to ask the question, do you want your wielder or weapon form to match? Now, one way that we can start to work out what we mean by this and what we think about this is to determine what type of weapons we are, which we can either roll a d6 to figure it out here, or we can choose from one of the 5 playbooks and go from there. In terms of the reason that the question is, do you want your wielder or weapon form to match, is because it's fundamentally about that every character is going to be to some degree an interplay of like, is it contrasting forms that makes them fun, or is it like likewise forms? So, for example, a likewise form in the game is Valeria. She transforms into a dagger. And she is a like Banksy type character outside of dagger form. She makes underground art, and she doesn't really abide by the law, and she goes and does whatever she wants. So she's a bit of a dashing rogue character who transforms into a dagger. Likewise form. Whereas another character, Leia, is a figure skater who's very athletic and graceful and turns into the biggest hammer on Earth, basically. So there's different ways to go about it, but if you want, you can simply roll a d6. It has all 5 options there for the general weapon types, and if you roll a 6, then you re-roll it and come up with something really weird.
I'm going to roll for mine.
All right, I'll roll for mine too.
Yeah, like I said, if you don't like the option, then just pick something else.
Yep. And are you going to roll as well, or do you want to pick yours?
I could make a character if you want, just like anytime.
Please make a character with us.
Yeah, if you guys are ever feeling stuck
this
or
is
whatever.
This is the whole shtick of our show is we all make characters together, sans GM, and then we never play them.
Yeah. So we would love for you to roll something up with us.
Absolutely.
Well, I rolled a 1.
Okay.
There can be overlap in this game, by the way. A character at like what you'd call max level only has 5 weapon moves total, and there are 13 for each weapon type.
Okay.
So even if you have 2 max level characters, they can have absolutely no overlap with each other.
Amazing. So I rolled energy for mine.
Nice. So that refers to weapons that their main form of attack doesn't rely on something physical. So for a fantasy equivalent, it would be like the quintessential flaming sword. Or for a sci-fi example, lightsabers.
Lightsabers.
Legally distinct lightsabers.
Yes.
Yep. Laser weapons.
I rolled a 6. So
a 6.
I'm gonna roll again.
You get to re-roll. Yeah.
Okay, and I got
I'm glad one of us got
yeah,
it.
so I got energy when I rolled again. So now I have to think of like a
Oh.
weird energy thing.
Yeah.
Anything your mind could bring up. So, like, an example is one of the weapons in the game that you could call like a hybrid. They don't quite fit in any of these sections. Is a scythe, right? And the moves that are inspired by the scythe special moves from the game are actually spread out across both energy and like blade, and I think also spike. But for instance, their energy aspect was gravity wells. Right? So you don't necessarily need it to be like a literal energy. The game assumes that it's either going to be like a freezing, burning, or like splitting weapon, right? Like lightning, you could argue, is splitting or shocking, right? But at the same time, you can still come up with a number of other ways for it to work. Like, all that a flaming weapon does in the game's terminology is it just gives you the sweep edge, which means you hit multiple opponents. So you could have a weapon where you're just a handle that shoots poison gas at stuff.
Yeah. I would like some kind of whip.
Ooh, there you go. All right.
Yeah, I don't know how I would add energy to that. I don't know what I want there.
Well, it could be a plasma whip. It could be an electrified whip or a flaming whip, like a demon's like big scourge, like the one from Lord of the Rings. You know, it could be
like a necrotic energy whip of sorts.
Yeah, that's it.
Dark
that's
energies. You want to go with dark energy? All right.
Always.
So we have a dark energy whip. I think I will go for building what I actually use then. And I will just be your standard longsword.
Love it.
Look at that.
Love it.
Solid longsword.
Amazing. I want to be like heavily dependent on what sort of setting we're playing in, right? But I think I want to leave it a little ambiguous exactly what I am until I figure out what setting we're in.
Well, I feel like we're like building a setting based on our weapons here at this point. Like,
yeah, I mean, we're building the characters before we choose the setting. We could just do the standard, like, it is modern and it's urban fantasy. And any sci-fi elements are more just a way of flavoring your magical weapon form.
Okay.
But we could also, if you want to, we could make this like a medieval fantasy, because I haven't actually gotten a chance to make any characters in a kind of medieval fantasy type thing. And so far, we have a longsword and we have a necrotic, like, death energy whip. So, like, you could go with an angel, like, flaming sword.
Pretty much anything.
You could do, like, a frost axe,
Okay.
All kinds of interesting stuff. You could do the abyss.
So I wonder, gosh, I think maybe like a wizard staff.
There you go. Right? A wizard staff.
Yeah.
It could be starfire or any level of all kinds of stuff, right? Or just magic, like the blue light magic that's common.
It's a gemstone.
Of course it is.
That affixes to a weapon like a staff or something like that.
Yeah. And that sounds awesome. All right. Well, you're definitely going to want to grab the fireball move, but we'll get there.
Call to action.
Yeah, like that.
So here is where we would normally say, hey, remember that thing we did?
I sure don't.
It's been quite a while since we actually recorded. It's been quite a while since I actually edited this series as well.
You like have all these out on our Patreon already, like weeks ago.
Yeah, exactly. But I do remember we had an absolutely fantastic time coming up with these characters. And I believe we are just getting to the point where we're actually like defining like some important details about our characters. We just picked our weapon types.
All right. I remember your character. I don't remember anything about my character, but I remember yours.
Really? You were a whip with necromantic energy capabilities.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That sounds like me.
And then Maso was a longsword.
Okay.
Very ordinary longsword. And
you were a staff?
I was a a wizard staff, or technically the gemstone that affixes to a wizard staff.
That's right.
And shoots out some magic. So yeah, it was a very interesting array of characters. The very interesting concept of people that turn into weapons that other people on your team use.
Yeah.
In dungeons.
Yeah, it's kind of wild, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, I really liked how interesting and unique of a concept this game is. And we get into some really interesting implications of that in the next couple of episodes. So
yeah,
I really hope everybody kind of stays tuned for those, because this game is pretty fantastic. And
I remember for sure our discussion episode is like amazing. So
yeah, absolutely.
And your character is really cool.
But yeah. Well, yours was really cool.
I feel like we all made really cool characters, but for some reason, yours has really stuck out in my brain.
Yeah.
Because I was like, sure, why not? Go for it.
Just latch onto it. Why not?
Be your best self.
Well, before we let you go for the day, let's get into our calls to action.
We've been getting some great engagement over on YouTube, our YouTube page, now that we've added our podcast there. Can you do podcasts on YouTube? Is that?
Yeah.
Oh.
It hooks in with your RSS feed
on there. Okay.
And it auto creates videos over there now for every episode we release on the public feed. And then people comment.
Oh, okay. So I can stop making video backups of things is what I'm hearing.
You can.
Okay. Cool. That's cool. Everyone, did you know we have YouTube? I'm finding out at the same time you are. Ryan, like, you get all of the information on all of that, like, you know, like all of the background stuff, it all goes to you. And you, like, I never even see that we have new emails pop up, because it's like the moment you get a notification, you're like, what? And then they're all read already. So like I come into our email and I'm like, oh, we haven't gotten anything new. So dear listeners, I'm finding out about all of this at the same time you are. You can get podcasts on YouTube. Apparently people are commenting on them. So if you want to join the conversation over there, you can head over to youtube.charactercreationcast.com and subscribe.
Absolutely.
That's cool and exciting.
It is a lot of fun seeing. Yeah, it's a lot of fun seeing the engagement over there. I was really interested in that, because it was like not even a day that we had transferred the podcast there. And people were like, hey, I'm listening to your show and I have thoughts.
Oh, I'm going to have to go see what people are saying.
It's nice. Well, next up, we are also thrilled to welcome a couple new patrons to our community, Mark E. Fair and Drew Owen. Thank you both so much for your support. We are really glad to have you here with us. And if you listeners want to join Mark and Drew, you can head on over to patreon.com/charactercreationcast and sign up. You'll be able to get access to bonus episodes like our weekly chit chats, Patreon-only Discord channels, custom dice, personal thank you cards, and even a sticker of the month club, and a lot more. We think we offer a pretty decent array of rewards, and you could even try out the $5 tier for free for 7 days to see what the digital stuff is that we're all offering.
I think we've got a good setup going over there. But especially thank you, Mark and Drew, for joining. We love new people.
Exactly.
In addition to that, though, we love old people too. So we do thank everyone every episode. Like right now, we're going to do that right now. Starting with Lieutenant and DJG, aka Tigranosaurus. We are happy to have you here with us. Thank you.
We're glad to have you here with us as well. Eric Bonts and Daryl Hellader II, thank you for supporting.
I read that as thank you for shopping. Like, thanks for shopping. Oh, I'm tired. We're recording this at night.
I know.
Many thanks to Shadim Kabal and the Shyest Barbarian.
Benjamin Sweeney and Lorcan McInnes, thanks for believing in us.
Thank you to Rob Fletcher and Kevin Brown. We couldn't do this without you.
Tentacle Duck and Cole McCallum, we are so grateful to you. Thank you.
Just see if I can do this on the first try. Thank you, John Adamus and the peculiarly prickly piccolo playing possum, partially preparing to profoundly partake in the Percy Panda's punchy piano performance. Your support brings us so much joy. I did it first try. Claps for me.
Good job. Carlos Salazar and Eric S., thanks for believing on us.
Ross Kingston and Ian Popmeyer, thank you for your support.
Sorigoth and Liam G., thank you for your continued support as well.
We appreciate your support. Brian Colm and the Garden GM, thank you.
Thank you to Tom and Blue Kryptonite. We couldn't do this without you.
Thank you, Danny and Nicole Trainer. Your support really makes us smile. I'm so glad you're both here. Both former guests, too.
Mm-hmm. Liam Murray and Kenning, we're happy to have you here with us. Thank you.
Glappy. We're glappy you're here with us. We can't record these at night anymore.
No.
And many thanks to Brian Kurtz.
And thank you to all of our future Patreon supporters. Your assistance is allowing us to afford to make this show. And the more folks that join, the more we'll be able to do in the future. So head on over to patreon.com/charactercreationcast to join up right now.
Another way to show your appreciation and support is leaving a rating or review on places like Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, Spotify, Facebook, Post-it note on your fridge. Anywhere you can write little reviews. We love to see it. Every 5-star review helps us out and brings us a ton of joy. But also we read them here and thank you personally when we get new reviews, like we're going to do right now for this brand new review from, we had this discussion, Starmamac, Starmamac, Starmamac. I don't know how you say it. Dealer's choice. From the United States of America on iTunes, titled Fun Show That Will Help You Build More Interesting Characters. It's so refreshing to see a TTRPG podcast that's not about D&D. Though we did have D&D episodes. This show is a great way to learn about how character building works in different TTRPGs, and being walked through it with the game's creators is fun. Ryan and Amelia are engaging, warm hosts. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Guys, I love reviews. They make me so happy.
It's been so long.
I know, we haven't had one in a while.
I know, very much appreciated. Thank you so much. And that's all we have for today's episode. Stay tuned next week for the conclusion to the character creation portion of this series and to find out about the really amazing people/weapons we were able to make. Until then, take care, everybody. Stay safe, drink some water, give yourself some me time, and keep making those amazing people. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of this character creation series. We'll be back in part 2, picking up right where we left off.
Character Creation Cast is a production of the One Shot Podcast Network and can be found online at www.charactercreationcast.com. Head to the website to get more information on our hosts, this show, and even our press kit. Character Creation Cast can also be found on Twitter and Blue Sky at CreationCast, or on our Discord server at discord.charactercreationcast.com. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan Bolter, and I can be found on Twitter and Blue Sky at Lord Neptune or online at lordneptune.com. Our other host, Amelia Antrim, can be found on Twitter and Blue Sky at Ginger Reckoning. Music for this episode is used with a Creative Commons license or with permission from the podcast they originated from. Further information can be found within the show notes. Our main theme music is Hero Remix by Steve Combs and is used with a Creative Commons license. This podcast is owned by us under Creative Commons. This episode was edited by Ryan Bolter. Further information for the game systems used and today's guests can also be found in the show notes. If you'd like to support our show, find us on Patreon. Get access to bonus episodes, exclusive merch, and much more at patreon.com/charactercreationcast. Thanks for joining us. And remember, we find that the best part of any role-playing game is character creation. So go out there and create some amazing people. We'll see you next time.